is what is, in actuality, the beginning point for all of that waste that has to go down underground for 100,000 years or more. This is where you see the design stop. Now, Dr. Wallace talked about some of the dynamics that go into making these choices. For example, it's not good to use concrete because concrete over time will dissolve in a way that makes the ground more liquefied and less stable. These kinds of things are imagined, but at no place, if you were to go through all of the reports and all of the literature planning on deep geological storage, at no point do you see very many depictions of anything past the point where we're done with our job, where we put the waste in and we sealed it. That's the end. Any archaeologist can tell you that what you find when you dig up a site is not what the people who buried it intended it to be. Things happen over time. There's a lot of dynamics in nature. We don't really know. We can make all kinds of projections about what will happen to a specific piece of ground for 100,000 years. But we don't really have any idea. We can have some idea, but these are things that we will never see. These containers, these canisters, these copper canisters that are supposed to keep the fuel rods dry for 100,000 years, we'll never know if that worked. We're just doing the best we can to come up with something that probably will work. But those assumptions those doubts tend to be pushed aside. And what we see is those wonderful images of exactly how the canister will hold, how it will be surrounded by clay, how that will retard water, and then 100,000 years of uncertain conditions will start. Maybe we get it right. Maybe we get it partly right. Maybe we don't get it right. Based on everything human beings have done through the past, it's probably going to be a mixture of getting it a little bit right and getting it a little bit wrong. But we don't act like that's what we're doing. We act like we're getting it 100% right. We know how to do this. It's not a problem for us to bury this waste and to do it successfully in a way that will protect future generations. We have no idea that that's true. We've never contained something for 1,000 years, let alone 100,000 years. We don't know how this copper will really react to the various chemicals it encounters over 100,000 years. We can project it, but we're projecting it. We can't say that that will work, but we will call it competent management. We will say that it was done competently, because from where we sit, as the people who just build those tunnels and place the canisters and backfill it and walk away, it will look successful. Whatever happens down the line, we won't be here to see it. So we will believe we did it successfully because it's what we like to believe. It's what we want to believe. There's a scholar named Rob Nixon who came up with this idea of slow motion violence. Slow motion violence is essentially violence that happens too slowly to understand that it's violence. For example, placing toxic factories in lower income neighborhoods. The kinds of illnesses that may develop, the kinds of respiratory illnesses that children may develop, will happen so slowly that it won't be perceived as violence, but it is violence. It's slow motion violence. And so in my mind, deep geological storage is temporal violence. It's violence against future generations. It's not just slow motion. We are inflicting harm on future generations. We have thousands of generations of people who will be at risk because of the waste that we made. They didn't do it. They didn't benefit from the electricity. They weren't protected by the nuclear weapons. It's just the ground they're going to walk on. Is there going to be harm to those people? What is our responsibility to generations and generations of people for our waste, for what we did? Well, we'd like to think that our responsibility is to protect them. to warn them, to shield them from harm, to give them information about how to stay safe. Will we be successful at that? Again, maybe some success, maybe not some success. If we're not successful, this is incredibly toxic material. We are exerting violence against future generations. We are engaged in temporal violence. We think of violence as spatial, one state and another state, one person and another person. But this is violence towards people in the future. We ourselves won't really understand that we're being violent. But for people who have to endure this, when it goes wrong or where it goes wrong, it will be violence from people in the past exerted upon them. So part of the reason that I sometimes use the phrase slow motion nuclear war to talk about this kind of temporal violence is because of where the waste is currently, which is in the developed world, in the countries that were planning nuclear war. Here, for example, is a distribution of the spent nuclear fuel in the United States. It looks a lot like a targeting map from the Soviet Union in the Cold War. The nuclear testing all happened in colonial spaces, primarily colonial spaces. The UK did not test a weapon in the UK. The UK tested at first smaller weapons in Australia, in a former colony. Australia wouldn't let the UK test thermonuclear weapons, H-bombs there, so they went out to Kiribati and tested them at Christmas Island. So the actual weapons that were exploded in the developing world. The waste is all where the targets of the original nuclear war, that's where all the waste is located. If these sites, if there is leakage in these sites, it would basically resemble the aftermath of the nuclear war that never was fought. So in the end, it may be that by generating this waste, by generating something that really we don't have functional solutions, we cannot say we can protect this waste and store this waste for 100,000 years. We hope we can, but we can't really say that. It may well be that where these contaminations are in the future, where there's leakage, where there's breaching of these sites by human beings, that it's essentially the same places that would have been targets. Sellafield would have been a huge target in the nuclear war, would have been a primary target in a nuclear war. Well, it may be that 50,000 years from now, the conditions, if they bury the waste here, which clearly they intend to do, that the conditions won't be that dissimilar to had there been a nuclear war and had there been a number of thermonuclear weapons detonated on this site. One of the sad things that unfortunately I would say that troubles me and to me is a truth is that we do have to do something with this waste. We made this waste. This isn't a problem we might have. This is something we already did. There is no good solution to this. Maybe deep geological storage is the best solution. Maybe not the best. At this point, it certainly looks like the best solution, but that doesn't make it a good solution. That makes it's a horrible choice among even more horrible choices. And so one of the first things that we need to do is we need to come to terms with the fact that this is something we already did. This is a tragic act that already happened. We have to try to do the very best we can to have less impact on people in the future rather than more impact on people in the future. Nobody wants this waste where they live. It's not going to be good. And this is the position we put ourselves in. This is the position we put ourselves in by choosing to prepare for nuclear war and by choosing to generate electricity with this technology. So I wish I had some way to say that not storing it here, not storing the UK waste here, would somehow would be a solution. But it's just part of the problem. The fact that this waste exists is the real problem. it will be placed someplace in the UK. Based on human behavior and other examples that we have, it'll be placed where it already is, because it's the easiest thing for the government to do. And this is what the governments want to do, is what is easiest for them and not necessarily what is the best for the long term. But even if we were successful at keeping the waste out of this area, we still have to face the failure that we as a species have created by simply manufacturing this material that we have to do something with. So I don't bear any kind of happy news at all, although I do use Legos to make myself feel better. But this is what I would say to you is some of the dynamics that you're fighting with and some of the dynamics that you're facing is that these are not decisions that are made for optimum practicality. These are decisions that are made for political expedience, for the least cost, for the least. These are decisions that are made the same way we made the decisions that put us in this position to begin with and brought us this waste. So you can look at all of this history of getting to this point as actually incompetence, and this is what I fear, and that we all fear, is that the steps we take from now forward may be additional steps of incompetence. I'm very used to apologizing to people after I talk, because I never leave people feeling in any way better than when I started. So let me apologize to you all for this lecture. Anyways, that's all I have to say. I'm happy to answer questions or join conversation. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It's been very informative. I think one thing that interests me is that actually speaking to local people,
Yeah.
Who not necessarily involved with this, but who hold a viewpoint. A lot of people say, well, you know, the planning stage lasts for this long. This stage lasts for that long, and before you know where you are, 50 years has gone by.
Yeah.
So the current generation, although they've decided to build this thing, bear no responsibility for it whatsoever.
Absolutely.
And it's easy, and as you quite rightly point out, it really is like sweeping it under the carpet.
Yeah.
And goodness knows how many politicians are guilty of that over the years. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks for
And
the chat.
I would add that those people in 50 years
Yeah.
received none of the benefit.
No.
You know, this is something that even at its most beneficent framing was something that benefited 2 generations of people and then put over 1,000 generations of people at risk because of what those 2 generations got. And none of us chose that.
No.
But this is. But of course, those people 50 years from now, it's just something that will seem natural to them.
And if I may say something else, is years and years ago I read, something in a Sunday Times magazine or something, and they were saying, the article said that, the oldest building we have in the world are the pyramids, 5,000 years old, and I mean they're still there,
But they're not watertight.
No.
Yes, so believing that we can build storage that's intact for 100,000 years is fantasy.
And as you say, Japan, complete on the earthquake zone, isn't it? Yeah.
But because the problem has to be solved, it will be solved. And one of the benefits for our generation is that we won't see what happens.
No.
And so we'll all, and especially the people planning this, we'll all go to our graves thinking, yeah, that worked.
Will Japan export it to Sellafield?
I don't know that they would export it to Sellafield, but they might more likely try to export it to Mongolia or China or someplace like that, someplace nearby that could be talked into taking a lot of money to take the waste, someplace with a low population. That's possible. I could easily see Japan trying to talk Mongolia or some similar locale into taking it. So who knows? Yeah.
we can sort of imagine what might have constituted competence in the first place, you know, to actually admit that these things were only needed for plutonium, really, and the risks of nuclear power and the waste production would in fact catch up with us. It could have been predicted, but it wasn't. What would constitute competence now, given that it's only in the last 20 years perhaps that waste disposal has been taken seriously enough to propose looking at sites for geological disposal. When it was done here, they decided it wasn't right.
Yeah.
They had to rethink that because they so desperately need it.
Well, there were people thinking about it all along. The assumption was that there would be technologies developed that would manage the waste.
Yeah.
But then, so around 20 years ago, as you say, you know, enough people in the field began to realize that hasn't happened and it doesn't look like it's going to happen. So we need to find an alternative, and deep geological storage is the best one that people came up with.
Remember after Chernobyl, we had a meeting in Anchorage. It wasn't designed because of Chernobyl on waste disposal at the university, nuclear waste disposal.
Yeah.
And the government minister responsible for it at that meeting said, "I'm sorry, it's too late already."
Yeah. Well, the waste is already generated.
Yes, we've got this legacy, and
Absolutely.
we still don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and part of the reason we talked ourselves into it, you know, I mean collectively, is because the Cold War seemed so dire and the risk of the end of the world so close that just finding a way out of that, you know, we essentially were willing to not look at the consequences of our action, the long-term consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, and I realise there's no simple answer, but basically what would you think would be the best solution for the waste?
I don't know of anything better than deep geological storage. Maybe there is a better solution, but it's certainly the best one that I've ever heard of, even though I consider it a horrible solution. I don't consider it a solution.
Yeah.
But I certainly think that if we go forward with deep geological storage as a solution, that we would benefit from looking at it collectively as a species rather than nationally as individual governments, because there's likely to be some place on Earth that is the best place geologically to put it, and the notion that every country has the best place is kind of crazy, but we're locked into disposing it in this way because that's how we generated it, and that's how we allocate funding to deal with it. But again, that just reflects the world we live in today, and not the right way to do things over 100,000 years. So I don't know of any better way, but I think that there's much better processes, that's for sure.
I suppose it's getting somewhere where the geology is correct.
Hopefully, and I mean, and if we can empower them to think long term instead of think long term holistically, not just long term for the UK, not just long term for Japan. There's really practical reasons why that's the way we do it. Mostly that has to do with funding, really, because who's going to allocate these funds, right? And so, and how much would people of the world want to pay for the waste of the UK or for the waste of the Soviet?
But do you not think this waste that we look upon now could be fuel in the future?
No.
No.
I mean, you know, some amount of it could be reprocessed, but we're already at the point where it's not economical to operate nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
And so if we're at that point now, operating them just because, you know, it's a way to deal with the waste is not exactly best practices either.
Yeah. I'm just picking your brain here, so I've got answers for people who say to me in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you know, and unfortunately this is a situation where there aren't good answers, so it's simply trying to be pragmatic about bad choices,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to pick you up on the communications issue.
Yeah.
This is going to be a problem whether the waste goes underground, deep underground, as is proposed for England,
Yeah.
or nearer the surface, as I understand is proposed, not at the border in Scotland.
Right.
But surely that aspect, languages will change, sure, but so that will evolve over those eons of time into the future, and the communication will adapt to the current ways of communicating, won't it? So I wouldn't have thought myself that's going to be a particular problem.
Well, part of that's predicated on the notion of intact governance and intact social organization. Let's just say, for example, that there are dire changes from climate change, or that there's economic collapse, and we don't endure, let's say, 2,000 years in the future, a sophisticated technological society. Maybe there's some kind of cataclysm. Maybe the Earth is hit by a comet, and it creates essentially another extinction period, and we don't have the ability to use electricity and digital technologies and so forth. So there are scenarios whereby the competent management and transfer of knowledge may break down. That's part of the assumption.
That's one other thing about a completely different
Sure.
aspect of it. I used to work in an industry which produces a fairly benign range of waste, which produces this stuff, paper.
Yeah.
But there used to be a concept, I'm still not sure where it's current in the UK, of the best practicable environmental option for any type of waste generated, whether it's a liquid or a solid form. And when I worked in that industry, I mean, new paper mill sites would not have been allowed to be constructed unless the site had a best practical environmental option outlet for their waste. Yet we allow new nuclear power plants to be built in this country,
Yeah.
where certainly there is no option that is considered environmentally sound that is available at the present time.
Well, I would say that part of that is rooted in its origins collectively as a military technology. And so the military necessity, which was to defend ourselves against Soviet attack, or to deter Soviet attack, was enough to compel less than best practices. Once that technology was existing, in order for the military component to become more affordable, the use of commercial power plants helped to make the weapon production more affordable. So that sort of logic that can come from military necessity, or the sense of military necessity, sort of drove this outside of the boundaries of normal industrial practice, where those sorts of ethics would be instilled from an early stage into how you operate this. It's the fact that it's a legacy technology from the military, and that it began without those priorities. I would say that's sort of how we ended up in this situation, compared to other technologies that manage, varying levels of toxic waste, that do have to think about those things, that do have to factor in the costs of disposal and things like that from the start. Because of the inheritance of this technology to the military, that was just not factored in at the beginning.
How many more are in the pipeline? How many more nuclear power stations in the pipeline?
I'm not sure exactly, but I think it's about 30 or 40, and it's mostly in China, Russia, India, and potentially in a few developing countries.
Bangladesh.
Yeah, and so I know